Pep Bardouille is the director of the Bridgetown initiative and special advisor on climate resilience in the Prime Minister's office in Barbados, with more than 2 decades of experience in sustainable development. In a brand new report for the V20, the Bridgetown initiative have identified 10 such ideas. They call them super levers that can catalyze finance for climate vulnerable countries. Her keynote is titled Reform, a Frontline Perspective. Please welcome Pepukaye Bardouille.
Good afternoon. It's difficult to come in after lunch, and it's also difficult to come into an audience that's completely disagreeing that we're doing enough. So I hope that with this presentation, we'll be able to change your mind a little bit as to not only why we need to do it, but how. So what's really at stake? And I think it's important to start with a bit of personal context. I'm from the island of Dominica. It's about 65,000 people, and in 2017, we were hit by a Category 5 storm, Hurricane Maria, which did some very serious damage. $1.3 billion was lost in loss and damage overnight. And just to contextualize that, currently the loss and damage fund for global disasters is sitting at somewhere around $700 million. So this is what happens in a country of less than 70,000 people in 24 hours. And the impact of that is 226% of GDP. And how do you recover from that type of loss? But we're not the only country. We've seen wildfires, we've seen Hurricane Beryl that wiped out a number of countries in the Caribbean, including Barbados, that I work for at the moment. We've seen storms in Vietnam, cyclones in Mozambique, flooding in Pakistan. So the Bridgetown initiative, which is a global movement that together with the V20 and other initiatives, including the 4 Ps, the Paris Pact for People and Planet, and many others, are really advocating for systemic change. And if we don't have that systemic change, we're really not going to achieve the impact that I and many others, including Vod Vergaard, believe is possible. Why do we think that change is important? Well, vulnerable countries are home to 1/5 of the world's population. We only have about 4% of emissions, but the impact, the potential losses in terms of GDP, even conservatively, we don't have to look at 200% of Dominica. Conservatively, we're looking at 20% losses on average. And these are also some of the potentially fastest growing markets in the world. So on the one hand, you have a huge risk of loss. On the other hand, you have huge potential for growth. And of course, there's the human aspect, which is the injustice of the climate crisis. And what do we need in order to avert those losses and have that growth potential materialize? Close to $500 billion by 2030. So how do we get there? The super levers that I'm going to talk about are clustered into 4 categories. The first is countries need to be in the lead. We need to be in the driving seat. And we've heard this again and again this morning, so it's nothing new, but I'd like to give you a bit of a concrete example of how that could happen, together with a change in macroeconomic frameworks. Then, of course, we need new sources of capital, which we'll talk about, shift in incentives, and effective risk sharing. So bringing this to the context of Barbados, what does country ownership actually look like? Well, in our context, it looks like the development of an investment plan for prosperity and resilience, which covers all sectors of the economy. And how we define resilience is really not around climate change. How do we not suffer in the next climate disaster? It's about how do we ensure that we have a vibrant economy and how do we have thriving communities? And this is important because our country, Barbados in this case, is small, is a very highly educated population. But that population, as we've again heard before, doesn't always have the opportunities that we need domestically, and yet there is potential. So the economy and thriving communities is really at the core of all of this. Then we need a robust infrastructure and healthy ecosystems. Infrastructure is not there for its own sake. It's there to help ensure connectivity. It's there to help ensure medical services are provided and roads connect producers to export. So that has to be in good shape. And every year, the infrastructure of all the V20 countries is eroded bit by bit, a little bit more flooding, a little bit more rain, a little bit more drought. And so those are not the catastrophes you hear about on the news, but that's the slow onset climate change that has a massive impact on government budgets. And then the last bit is fit-for-purpose institutions, and Mavis spoke a little bit about this earlier, and I do think that we underestimate how important institutions are. How do we make sure that our government institutions, but also the institutions around government, the development partners, the MDBs that Vera will speak about in a minute, are actually serving the purposes? So we have set 15 goals that emerge into 12 specific areas, a little bit like Brazil's investment plan, a little bit like Colombia, that are action areas that will take us to where we need to go. And what are we trying to achieve? What's our objective? It's really three things. The first is that we want to have higher growth rates. The second is that when, and it's not a question of if, it is a question of when, we are hit by the next climate shock, that the impact is a little bit lower than it would have been if, in fact, ideally a lot lower, but certainly lower than it would have been if we weren't built to resilient standards. And the last bit is that our time to recovery is quicker. So this is really what we're trying to achieve in just one visual: growth, a quicker bounce back, and lower impact when the crisis hits. So we have our investment plan. We've costed it. It's not everything that the country needs to do for the next 10 years, but it's most of the things. So I would say 80 to 90%. And that's going to cost us about $11.6 billion US. Now, Barbados' economy is fairly small. Our GDP is $5 billion. So that's a doubling, double our GDP over the next 10 years. And that's just the investment we need to make into infrastructure and other tangible capital assets, right? So that's a lot of money. We're not standing here asking for handouts, because the really good news, and it's a bit of a complex chart, but happy to share the plan with you. The really good news is that we can actually do quite a bit of this investment through debt swaps, debt conversions. That's taking expensive money that we've borrowed under certain conditions and swapping it out through some very fancy financial engineering for cheaper loans that require guarantees. Someone has to back the loan. That requires projects that we're going to take the proceeds of our savings to put into. So it requires quite a bit of effort to structure, but it can be done, and it has been done. Barbados did a debt for nature swap and a debt for climate swap, and we plan to do more. So part of our investment plan, our financing of that plan, is to do more debt swaps. And so we need to find a way to do those more easily. But the other really cool bit is that over 50% of our plan, if we get it right, can be funded through private sector investment. A lot of that will be in energy, quite a bit will be in housing, quite a lot will be in the tourism sector, because of course these are all revenue generating. But the rest that are not revenue generating, that's coastal roads that have to be rebuilt. We don't have tolls, it's a small island. That's the sea defenses that cost tremendous amounts. That's a coral restoration. That's making sure that lower income fishing communities are in good shape. That has to be financed through the public sector. And we're very happy to try and find ways to do that. Because if we get the investment right, there'll be more growth. And if we grow more, there'll be more tax revenue, right? GDP goes up, and you can also borrow a little bit more if the way that development institutions look at that all-important equation of debt to GDP changes. Right now, we cannot swap our way to resilience, but we could potentially borrow our way there under the right terms. That means the money needs to be affordable, and we have to be given the borrowing headroom. So how debt is considered and how nature is factored into that debt to GDP ratio is really, really important. So I've talked very quickly about the first point, right, which is countries in the lead in these macroeconomic frameworks. But the last 3 points are the basis of these 10 super levers. So cheaper capital. How do we increase, and again, Mavis spoke to this, right? We're asking for a new issuance of SDRs, but at the very minimum, we need to rechannel the special drawing rights that have already been allocated so that multilateral development banks can leverage that money and on-lend it to us at more affordable terms. We also need, and Barbados co-chairs the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force together with Kenya and France, we definitely need to look at levies on sectors that are high emissions. That is certainly shipping. To some degree, it's aviation, and there we need to be a little bit careful for tourism-dependent economies, that we're not actually shooting ourselves in the foot, but there are ways to do this. But this point, and Bodvegar mentioned it, around solidarity is critical. That means that everyone in this room has to understand that we have a part to play in this puzzle, and that solidarity comes into the mix. We definitely need to reset market incentives. Look, subsidies to the fossil fuel sector are in the trillions, direct and indirect, around $7 trillion, and certainly over $1 trillion annually directly to fossil fuels. What is the point of subsidizing one sector when we don't have enough resources for the other, particularly in smaller countries where battery storage is key and the cost of those technologies hasn't come down yet? We need to change the capital adequacy framework that's implemented in the multilateral development institutions and make sure that recommendations of the G20 are actually put into place. And of course, we need to catalyze that all-important private capital. Private investment is sitting on the margins, and there is plenty of it. How do we effectively de-risk, including through foreign exchange hedging? And then one sector that's not at the table enough is insurance. They do need to be part of the mix. The insurance industry has over $35 trillion in assets. How does that money get channeled into resilience and into resilient investment? And how do we make sure that we are guaranteeing many of the loans that are at risk through insurance? I'll leave it there, but we have the solutions. Read the paper. You can find it at the V20 website or at the Bridgetown Initiative website. Thank you.